In a trade war between the U.S. and China, China wins. China does not depend on the U.S. market very much. It's about 12% of China's exports. China will do just fine. It's just dumb policy. We are in one-person rule in the United States. Our political system is in a state of collapse.
Well, it's official. Donald Trump is accelerating the collapse of the U.S. economy and dragging America's global standing down with it. Meanwhile, China's president is traveling around the world, securing new trade deals with the fastest growing economies and preparing his country for this intense next chapter in U.S. China relations. Tariffs are Trump's weapon of choice against China. But the on-again, off-again nature of these tariffs has created complete policy whiplash, confusing governments, rattling international markets, and making it nearly impossible to predict what's coming next. Even on this channel, it's been a challenge to bring you consistent updates as the goalposts are shifting every other day. But one thing hasn't changed. No matter how this ends, China is going to win this trade war. Unlike the chaos in Washington, Beijing is moving forward with discipline. After being caught off guard during Trump's first administration, China has spent years planning 10 steps ahead. Every time the US makes a move, China hits back with a calculated counterstrike, knowing exactly where to apply pressure. And now it's becoming painfully obvious. The Trump administration had no plan, no foresight, and not even an understanding of how tariffs actually work. Trump keeps repeating that tariffs will make other countries pay back the US, when in reality, the cost is being eaten by American businesses and passed straight to the American consumer. In today's video, we're breaking down the current state of Trump's trade war, exposing the damage it's doing to the American economy and showing why, no matter what he does, China is walking away with the win. But make sure you stay tuned to the end as I'll show you a direct way that you can profit from this chaos. And it comes from one of the most vulnerable industries in the world, in a sector of the economy in which China controls 90% of global production, and that is rare earth minerals. Let's jump into it. Now, one of the biggest illusions driving this trade war is the Trump administration's completely inflated view of the American economy, and more specifically, the American consumer. If you listen to top US officials, they'll tell you with a straight face that China has no choice but to cut a deal. Trump's team wants you to believe that Beijing is desperate for access to the US consumer market, and as a result, America holds all the cards. This is what happens when a country starts believing its own propaganda. Take it straight from the mouth of billionaire Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick.
The table with Donald Trump or they don't. But let's be clear, we are their biggest client by far, by far, by far. The American consumer buys everything from China. They can't afford to be without us, and that's where we are today.
Lutnick and Washington are stuck in the 1990s. They think the US is the unchallenged center of the global economy, and that everyone else is just trying to sell into it. But this outdated American exceptionalism has become a massive strategic blind spot. While the US consumer base is still significant, the days of it being the global engine are long gone. The real growth is happening elsewhere, and China is now the top trading partner to the majority of the world's countries, a far cry from the US-dominated world map some 25 years ago. And that shift matters. While the US is stuck fantasizing about the golden era that no longer exists, China has spent the past decade building a real economic future. From Latin America to Africa to Southeast Asia, Beijing has been investing, trading, and forming relationships. Meanwhile, Americans are drowning under inflation, watching their rent skyrocket and their grocery bills pile up. This is not a country of consumers with spare cash for new high-tech Chinese products, as 60% of Americans are just trying to survive paycheck to paycheck. So when US officials claim that China needs access to the American market, they're completely detached from reality. Not only are they overestimating the American market, they are highly underestimating the Chinese market at the same time. Contrary to the outdated stereotypes, China's economy is no longer dependent on export. As this graph from the global economy illustrates, exports now make up just 19.7% of China's GDP, a far cry from the 36% peak in 2006, showing a rapidly decreasing reliance on exported goods and an increase in power from the domestic Chinese consumer. To put that in perspective, the average percentage of a country's GDP coming from exports is over 45%. That means that China, at 19.75%, is actually much less reliant on exports than most countries. China has become its own best customer, with 80% of China's economic activity now coming from domestic consumption. And while American officials still picture China as a sweatshop churning out cheap goods for Walmart shelves, that version of China has moved elsewhere many years ago. China's #1 export destination hasn't been the US for almost a decade. The #1 partner since 2016 is the ASEAN bloc, where trade has been steadily rising. At the same time, the percentage of Chinese exports to the US have fallen from 19% in 2018 to under 15% in 2024. Beijing planned for this shift. Washington hasn't. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is starting to wise up. Countries that once played along with American leadership are now openly pushing back. Even some of Washington's closest allies are calling out the bullying.
The US is saying is already an impossible task, the theory is already a mess, and there is no consistency whatsoever. However, if Japan were to negotiate about what they have been saying, well, to put it bluntly, it would be akin to a delinquent kid extorting someone.
That's a Japanese government representative going as far as comparing the US to a mafia-style extortionist. And it's not just talk. Japan and South Korea have signed new trilateral trade agreements with China in direct response to Trump's tariffs, overcoming long-standing strained relations. Meanwhile, Vietnam, another country with historically tense relationship with Beijing, welcomed Xi Jinping for a high-profile visit and signed a record 45 new trade deals. We are seeing in real time that the United States is being isolated as the world is rearranging itself. And Beijing? Well, quite frankly, they've stopped playing nice. In contrast to their more traditional, more passive reactions to America's actions, Chinese government officials have started posting notably defiant statements, standing their ground and calling out the weaponization of tariffs to coerce and bully other nations.
China is fully prepared to fight to the very end because the world is big enough that the United States is not the totality of the market in the world. So if the United States wants to go in that direction of completely shutting itself out of the China market, be my guest.
Yeah, and China will lose the US market, which, as I've said, is 15%.
We don't care. We don't care. China has been here for 5,000 years. Most of the time, there was no United States, and we survived. Right. And if the United States wants to bully China, we will deal with the situation without the United States. And we expect to survive for another 5,000 years.
That's quite the bold statement from Victor Gao, the vice president of the Center for China and Globalization, who doesn't sugarcoat how Chinese people really feel about Trump's actions. I mean, you know things are going crazy in U.S. China relations when the Chinese embassy in Washington, D.C. is sharing videos of Ronald Reagan to help Americans remember why tariffs never work.
Over the past 200 years, not only has the argument against tariffs and trade barriers won nearly universal agreement among economists, but it has also proven itself in the real world, where we have seen free trading nations prosper while protectionist countries fall behind. America's most recent experiment with protectionism was a disaster for the working men and women of this country. When Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930, we were told that it would protect America from foreign competition and save jobs in this country. The same line we hear today. The actual result was the Great Depression, the worst economic catastrophe in our history. 1 out of 4 Americans were thrown out of work. Yet today, protectionism is being used by some American politicians as a cheap form of nationalism. We should beware of the demagogues who are ready to declare a trade war against our friends, weakening our economy, our national security, and the entire free world.
Trump is now being forced to back down. He's granted wide-ranging exceptions for Chinese products, especially tech, like iPhones and computers. This is after industry leaders and CEOs like Tim Cook reportedly begged him to reverse course. Apple warned the Trump administration that iPhones alone would cost thousands, if not tens of thousands more dollars if they were produced domestically in the United States. The US simply doesn't have the capacity to rebuild those supply chains anytime soon. In response to these exemptions, Beijing still hasn't lifted its tariffs. In fact, they've escalated, slapping export bans on heavy rare earths, which are critical to U.S. defense manufacturing. But what happens next? I want to highlight a story that goes deeper than just geopolitics, because behind every trade war, every missile, and every high-tech system, there is a supply chain of rare earth minerals that is needed to power each of these industries. And there is one metal in particular that could very well determine the outcome of future conflicts, and that is antimony. Now, you might not have ever heard of antimony, but it's the backbone of modern defense systems. Without it, there are no armor-piercing bullets, no missile guidance systems, no flame retardants for military gear, and even some semiconductors and nuclear tech stop functioning. It's literally that essential. But here's the problem. The United States produces almost none of it. China and Russia dominate the global supply, and just recently, China banned antimony exports, sending prices soaring to over $60,000 per ton. That's not just market volatility. It's a national security risk. The Pentagon knows this, so do NATO allies, and that's where the opportunity comes in. Enter Military Metals Corp, ticker MILI in Canada and MILIF in the United States. They're one of the only publicly traded companies laser focused on securing a Western-controlled antimony supply, and their flagship project is located in Slovakia, right in the heart of Europe. This isn't some early-stage exploration gamble. Their Slovakian asset contains over 60,000 tons of high-grade antimony ore, originally estimated by Soviet-era geologists, estimates that the company is now upgrading to modern standards. At today's prices, that ore could be worth over $3 billion. But here is where things get very interesting. The U.S. government has already recognized this vulnerability. In 2022, it granted $1.83 billion to Perpetua Resources, another antimony developer in Idaho, under the Defense Production Act. Perpetua trades under PPTA and now has a market cap of over $1 billion, based largely on its strategic value of its antimony project. So let's connect the dots. Perpetua has proven there's a $1 billion market cap waiting for companies that can help the West escape China's grip on critical natural resources. And right now, Military Metals is one of the very few companies in the world positioned to follow that same path. Military Metals is still flying under the radar and represents an early stage opportunity in a sector that's about to go mainstream as the West scrambles to secure critical minerals. But Military Metals is not just relying on this project in Slovakia. In Canada, their West Gore mine, a former producer, still has ore piles from historical production that are ready for reprocessing. This isn't about building from scratch. It's about reviving overlooked strategic assets at a time when global demand is exploding. With NATO defense spending projected to hit $1.5 trillion and U.S. military planners pushing for domestic and allied supply chains, Military Metals could be exactly the kind of company the market is about to reward. And for retail investors, especially those who follow defense, national security, or strategic metals, this is one of the very few pure-play antimony opportunities that's publicly available right now. Let's make one thing clear. The tariff war and trade battle between the United States and China isn't going to finish anytime soon. And with China processing over 90% of the world's rare earth minerals, it's the one sector the United States is most vulnerable in. Western governments need to reshore supply chains of critical minerals, and this is a company you want to have on your radar. And to help you out with that research, I'm going to include the company's stock tickers, website, and investor presentation down in the description below. Their website breaks down the Slovakian and Canadian projects in detail and shows exactly how they plan to scale. Donald Trump launched this trade war believing he had the upper hand, but even America's legacy media companies can't hide the truth anymore. With the Wall Street Journal writing, China called Trump's bluff and seems to have won this round. All this chaos with trade policy flipping back and forth has done exactly what you'd expect. It's thrown the entire global market into disarray. There is now so much uncertainty, businesses can't plan more than a few months ahead, let alone make the kind of long-term investments that manufacturing requires. China is the factory of the world, and if you're doing almost any kind of business today, odds are your supply chains run through China at some point. But these tariffs have smashed that foundation. Family-run businesses, all the way to massive multinational corporations, are now caught between rising costs and no visibility into what happens next. And so, here we are, caught in the crosshairs of one man's ego in a trade war that he doesn't even understand. Donald Trump promised to make America great again, but what he's delivered is chaos, skyrocketing prices, broken alliances, and an economic strategy so erratic it's chasing away investors, alienating partners, and driving the U.S. economy straight off a cliff. All while China plays it cool, patient, and strategic, picking up influence, winning trade partnerships, and locking its position as the backbone of the global economy. What we're watching right now isn't just a policy failure. It's the systematic unraveling of the American credibility on the world stage. A president who promised strength has exposed weakness. A trade war meant to cripple China is instead speeding up the decline of the US dollar, the collapse of American soft power, and a global pivot toward a new economic center of gravity in the Far East. And the worst part, none of this had to happen. The US wasn't outmatched. It was simply outplayed by a country that studied its opponent, made its moves deliberately, and refused to blink. So while Trump waits by the phone for a call from Xi Jinping that may never come, the rest of the world is already moving on. Everyone, once again, thank you for making it to this point of the video, and thank you to Military Metals for sponsoring today's important episode. I always say that we study geopolitics because it moves markets, and all of you who are investors know this firsthand on how volatile the stock market has been the past month. But I'm very bullish on gold and rare earth minerals because they will always be at the center of global trade and certainly going to move the markets in terms of economic chaos. But as always, make sure you do your own research before making any investments, and make sure that you check out our sponsors' notes down in the description below. As always, I want to thank you all for your incredible support and look forward to seeing you all in our next video soon.